Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping right into some, well, genuinely surprising economic news coming out of Canada. The latest data seems to point to a really significant shift in the job market. We're talking unemployment numbers hitting a 9-year high. If you sort of look past those very unusual pandemic years, that's a stat that definitely makes you sit up and take notice. So our mission here is to go beyond just that headline figure, to really unpack what these numbers mean, what's driving them, and maybe most importantly, what the ripple effects could be for the wider economy and, for you. Okay, let's get into this data.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really fascinating, I think, is just how quickly the whole economic story seems to have shifted. For quite a while, the reports were all about Canada's resilience,
Yeah.
even with all the global stuff going on. But this latest August data we have from StatsCan, well, it paints a remarkably different picture. It suggests maybe a more rapid, perhaps even a deeper change happening under the surface than many people were expecting. This doesn't look like just a minor blip. It feels more like a real pivot in the underlying conditions.
And that context is so important for seeing the whole picture, isn't it? So let's delve into those specific headline figures that make this shift seem so stark. The data showing Canada had almost 1.6 million people unemployed in August. I mean, that's a huge number when you stop and think about it. And the unemployment rate itself, it jumped zero point 0.2 percentage points, hit 7.1%.
Right.
And just to give that some perspective, if we, like you said, exclude the really unusual 2020-2021 pandemic period, that's a level we haven't actually seen since May 2016.
May 2016. So yeah, almost a decade peak. That's definitely notable.
It really is. But it's not just about the rate changing, is it? The economy actually shed jobs. A lot of them. 65,500 jobs gone in August. And what's particularly striking, the analysis we looked at explicitly says this was the worst single month of job losses since January 2022.
Yeah, that really speaks to a serious downturn, at least for that month.
Definitely.
And it wasn't just, slightly off from what people expected. It was way off. A complete reversal, actually. The analysts that Reuters polled, for instance, they were actually forecasting net job gains. They thought maybe 10,000 jobs would be added. And they predicted the unemployment rate might just, edge up a tiny bit. It's 7.0% from 6.9%.
Okay, so a loss of 65,500 and a rate of 7.1%. That's way worse than predicted.
Much worse. And when you see that kind of significant miss, it really suggests that the economic issues going on are maybe deeper than we thought, or maybe they're just accelerating faster than the models could catch. And to get even more context on the labor market's health, we also look at things like the employment rate, the share of the population that's actually working. That fell to 60.5% in August, which is, interestingly, its highest level since the pandemic.
Wait, shouldn't a falling rate be lower?
Good catch. Sorry, I misspoke there. It fell to 60.5%, which is actually its lowest level since the pandemic started winding down. My apologies.
Okay, lowest. That makes more sense with job losses.
Exactly. Lowest since the pandemic. And then there's the participation rate that's crucial, too.
Yeah.
It shows how many people are active in the economy, working or looking for work. That dropped to 65.1%. Also, the lowest since the pandemic recovery began. These aren't just, abstract numbers. They mean fewer people are actively working or even trying to find work relative to everyone else.
Yeah.
It points to a broad cooling off.
So it's not just jobs disappearing, but maybe fewer people even looking, a sort of broader contraction in the workforce. That really does underline how serious this might be. These numbers are definitely striking, unexpected. But the real deep dive starts when we ask why. Why now? What forces are really shaping this sudden shift, according to the sources we've looked at? And right near the top of that list, the analysis keeps pointing to the role of U.S. trade policy and those persistent tariffs.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme.
The research explains that this sort of continuous uncertainty around what the U.S. might do next on trade has kept businesses, and I quote, on tenterhooks. And that directly leads to them holding back on hiring, holding back on investments, which, well, obviously hits the job market. We saw this initially, didn't we? In specific sectors like auto manufacturing, steel manufacturing, they saw big job losses pretty directly because of U.S. tariffs.
Precisely. And it's not just about that initial hit, the first domino. The materials we're reviewing, they talk about what they call pass-through effects, which basically means tariffs that first hit, say, steel or cars. They don't just stop there. They ripple through the whole supply chain. They squeeze businesses that rely on those goods or businesses involved in moving them around.
Right, like if you use steel and steel costs more.
Exactly. Your costs go up. You become less competitive. Maybe you have to cut back somewhere else, like hiring. And this whole situation really brings up a big question. How long can an economy keep showing resilience when you've got these major external factors creating so much uncertainty for businesses everywhere. It just creates this climate of caution, right? Where putting expansion plans on hold, delaying new hires, that becomes the default. And the analysis is pretty clear on where the major brunt, as they put it, of this has been felt recently. Transportation and warehousing, vital for moving all those goods, lost a huge 22,700 jobs just in August. And manufacturing lost another 19,200.
Wow, those are big numbers in key sectors.
They are, and they're deeply tied into trade, into the movement of goods. So they're really vulnerable when trade policy gets unpredictable.
It's pretty stark how those initial shocks can just spread out like that. But here's what I found even more surprising, digging into the data. The impact isn't just sticking to those goods-producing industries anymore. The service-producing sector, which, let's remember, makes up almost 80% of all jobs in Canada, it also took a major hit. The services sector actually shed a net 67,200 jobs in August. That's huge.
67,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's substantial for services.
And maybe the most striking part. The single biggest loss wasn't in retail or hospitality, which sometimes fluctuate more. It was a whopping 26,100 jobs lost in professional, scientific, and technical services. I mean, that's a sector we often think of as stable, high value, kind of an indicator of a modern economy, right?
Absolutely. That's a critical point.
So seeing losses there suggests something maybe deeper is going on than just the direct trade impacts, doesn't it? What does that tell us about overall business confidence? And then there's this detail about part-time jobs taking a big hit too. How does that add another layer here?
It really does suggest the slowdown is much broader now. It's not just contained to industries directly hit by tariffs anymore. When you see professional, scientific, technical services shedding jobs like that, it's often a strong signal about overall business confidence really eroding. Companies might be cutting back on consultants, maybe research projects, IT services, perhaps even legal or accounting help. It suggests they're either bracing for tougher times ahead, or they're scaling back their own plans, or maybe just seeing less need for those kinds of support functions because the whole economy is slowing down.
Which then feeds back into consumer spending, presumably.
Directly. Fewer people working, less certainty, less disposable income getting spent, and the data also points out it's hitting certain groups harder. The reports mention that the summer funk isn't over yet for young, jobless Canadians, which suggests young people trying to enter the workforce, or maybe people looking for those more flexible part-time jobs, they're really feeling this acutely, especially since, as you mentioned, a large chunk of the overall job losses were specifically in part-time roles. Makes it tough to get a foothold.
A tough environment for sure.
Now, it wasn't all bad news across the board. There was one interesting outlier the analysis pointed out. Construction actually saw job gains, about 17,100 jobs added.
Oh, interesting. Even though it's sort of goods producing.
Yeah, it is noteworthy. It might reflect some big housing projects still underway, or maybe infrastructure investments that are a bit insulated from those immediate trade pressures, or perhaps it's just a lag effect from earlier strong demand. But definitely an outlier in the August numbers.
That construction gain is a curious little bright spot in a mostly gloomy picture. But speaking of things that seem, well, almost contradictory, let's talk about wages, another fascinating detail the analysis highlights. Despite all these job losses, the average hourly wage for permanent employees, it actually grew by 3.6% in August. It hit $37.81 an hour. And that's actually up slightly from the 3.5% increase the month before.
Right.
So, okay, on one side, we have a job market looking worse in terms of sheer numbers, jobs lost. But on the other, the people who do have permanent jobs are seeing their wages tick up a bit faster. What does that seemingly paradoxical trend tell us? What's going on there, and what does it signal for, say, inflation?
It's a really crucial paradox, actually. And it definitely raises questions about how persistent inflation might be, even while the job market itself is clearly cooling. That average hourly wage growth figure, that's something the Bank of Canada watches like a hawk. It's a key gauge for them on underlying inflationary pressures. Normally, you'd expect a weaker job market, less competition for workers, to slow down wage growth.
Right, makes sense.
But the fact that wages are still growing, maybe even accelerating slightly, it suggests a couple of possibilities. Maybe there's still real tightness in specific skilled parts of the labor market. Certain specialized jobs might still be really hard to fill despite the broader losses. Or it could just reflect workers still needing and demanding higher pay to keep up with the cost of living with the inflation that's already happened.
So inflation itself is kind of keeping wages up even as jobs disappear.
It could be part of the dynamic. This persistent wage growth, even as the job market weakens overall, It really highlights a tricky pressure point for the Bank of Canada. It suggests that while the overall demand for labor might be falling, maybe the supply in certain skilled areas is still short, creating a kind of wage floor. And that makes the bank's fight against inflation even more complicated. You saw the market react instantly to this weak jobs report, didn't you? The odds, based on market pricing, of the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates this month, they shot up to 90%.
90%. Wow.
Yeah, investors are now strongly betting the bank will have to ease policy, cut rates to stimulate the economy, even with that lingering wage growth number, which, again, paradoxically, makes their inflation mandate harder. It's a real tightrope they're walking.
It certainly sounds like a high-stakes balancing act. Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. We've really unpacked a truly complex picture of Canada's economy right now. Unemployment hitting that 9-year high outside the pandemic weirdness. A big jump in the number of unemployed people. Broad job losses hitting goods-producing sectors, sure, but also, surprisingly, key service sectors and part-time roles especially. A lot of this seems driven by that ongoing uncertainty around trade policy.
Seems to be a major factor.
Yet, right in the middle of this slowdown, we're seeing these intriguing countertrends, like wages still rising, which, as you said, adds layers of complexity for the Bank of Canada's next moves. It really just reinforces how valuable it is to look beyond the headlines, doesn't it? To get into the nuances in the data.
Absolutely. And these specific details, the unexpected losses in those professional services, the fact that analysts were so far off, the wage growth sticking around even with job losses, it paints a picture that's anything but simple. And it kind of prompts us to ask, okay, what does this specific mix of factors really tell us about the underlying strength or maybe the vulnerability of Canada's economy right now? How might these things, all tangled together, shape what the Bank of Canada does next with interest rates? And maybe more personally, what ripple effects could that have on your own financial world? Your mortgage, your job prospects, even just the costs of things you buy every day. It's just a powerful reminder that these big economic shifts, even though they're often talked about as numbers, they have very real, very personal consequences for all of us.
That's a really important thought for you to consider as you navigate your own financial landscape. We really hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of the forces currently shaping Canada's evolving economy. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to diving deep with you again very